Having recently built a Game Boy Advance with a 3.15-inch touchscreen, we knew we could do better. So this time, we turned our attention to creating an original Game Boy Advance with a 4.1-inch screen. Earlier in the year, we added a 4.1-inch screen to a Game Boy Color and a Game Boy Advance SP, and it was no easy feat, so we knew this mod would be quite challenging. Being up for the challenge, we created some initial plans on how a 4.1-inch backlit screen from a GBAXL would fit into an original Game Boy Advance. After initial measurements, it was found that the only way we could fit a 4.1-inch screen into an original Game Boy Advance was to merge two shells together to add an extra inch to the width of the original Game Boy Advance. So after going through our warehouse of unused stock, we found two appropriate shells that would do the job. The first task involved removing all the internals, as it wouldn't be necessary for this build, as we plan to use an amalgamation of DSi, GBAXL, and Game Boy Advance internals. Our next focus was to measure and trim the shells down to their appropriate size and join them together using a mixture of plastic and hard epoxy resin. With the size now being adequate, our next focus was to fill in the gaps using slow setting epoxy resin. With a lot of filling and over 24 hours of drying, we were pleased on how the shell turned out. Now it's just a matter of block sanding it with 180 grit to remove any lumps or imperfections, and then follow it up with some Bondo. After what felt like an eternity of sanding, the cartridge slot was filled in, a notch was cut out for the LCD screen, and the USB-C and rear triggers were also machined out. After a little bit more bogging and sanding, the shell was now ready for its first coat of primer filler. After several more coats of primer and filler, the front and rear was ready for its top coat of silver paint, followed by 2 coats of clear. With the shell finally complete, our attention now focused on removing the LCD screen from a damaged GBAXL console. As there are no aftermarket kits fabricated for amalgamating a GBAXL, and Game Boy Advance together, we had to improvise. So in this instance, we had to solder and create our own adapter. Next, we test fitted the 4.1-inch screen to the shell that we just fabricated. Previously, in our Game Boy Advance featuring a 3.15-inch screen, we used the touchpads from a broken Game Boy Advance motherboard, but we were lucky enough to source an aftermarket set from AliExpress for a few dollars. This would definitely make life a lot easier. As DSi internals would only fit, we decided to use the battery from a GBAXL for sustained battery life. The buttons, rubbers, and aftermarket touchpads were then mounted to the Game Boy Advance shell, as well as preliminary wiring. As this console was going to be a hybrid, we would use the internals from an original DSi and then marry them to a GBAXL screen. The motherboard was then removed and stripped down to its bare minimum. For this build, there was no need for the control ports or mounting points, as we will be soldering directly to the points on the motherboard. The initial part of the build involves disabling the top screen. This is done by soldering a 330 ohm resistor to the PCB itself. The headphone jack is also removed and bridged. The speaker and bottom screen were then mounted and connected, and the motherboard was test fitted. Once pleased with the test fitting of the motherboard, we then used 36 AWG ultra thin wire to solder all the points from the original motherboard to the aftermarket touchpads for the Game Boy Advance. Finally, the power button, USB-C charging, and original DSi camera were mounted to the console before it was assembled for its final time. Enjoying this video? Now's the perfect time to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. After months in production, we've finally completed our latest project, introducing the Game Boy Advance XL. This custom-made console is a hybrid between an original Game Boy Advance with DSi and GBAXL internals. The exterior was fabricated by hand using two old Game Boy Advance shells. Trigger buttons are mounted in the rear, as well as the original DSi camera. The console features USB-C charging, as well as the original DSi cartridge slot, and a tactile button was used to initiate the power on this console. The seamless unibody shell was sprayed in titanium silver finish. Purple chrome anodized buttons were used to finish off the console. And with a bit of ingenuity, the 4.1-inch screen from a GBAXL was married to the DSi internals. Utilising an R4 flash cartridge, this console is filled with all your favourite emulators and is capable of playing all your favourite Sega, NES, Neo Geo, Game Boy Original, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, and some single-screen DS games, just to name a few. For extended gameplay, the console also features the battery from the GBAXL. Just when you thought the aftermarket 3-inch screens were adequate from the Game Boy Advance, we've taken it to the next level. After watching this video, we hope we've inspired you in creating your own custom console. In the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel and check out our other videos. Stay safe.